As a synopsis, I'd say growing up in Birmingham was like, it was a case where at times I felt as if I lived two different kind of lifestyles or had to wear two different types of hats growing up. And I say this because I clearly was aware of the differences when it came to race and people at a very early age. Going to school, I recognized that, the food that we ate was different than what was at school. I recognized that the language is also different. What we listened to musically was also different. Our culture, activities and, social life was somewhat different. So it was a case of me bobbing and weaving between different cultures. So I'll be at home speaking my Jamaican patois language, eating a Jamaican food, the whole stories about Jamaica. And then I'll go to the infant school just down the road, less than half a mile. That it's going to be up. It must be very much English. The neighbors that are around us are very much English as well. And having said that, as a result, I also experienced racism at a very early age as well. The kind of energy that was in my household when my parents came home from work, and sort of indicated how they were treated in a certain kind of way. You know, um, because of their color and things like that. So yes, that was part of my upbringing. It was no negative. I mean, I clearly remember across the street there was a lot of old buildings that we called bomb buildings. As let's face it, we were really coming out of World War II, and there were still other buildings that were around that still needed to be, you know, developed and sort of re-erected, so to speak, or knocked down and put into the more modern way of doing things and the whole visual scenery. So we were exposed to remnants of World War II at the same time. My parents came over in the mid 50s separately. My father first came over in the early part of '54. My mother followed him a year later, and there we were. We already had children from my parents who already had children back in Jamaica. So we became the first generation of blacks born in England too, but parents from the Caribbean in the '50s. That actual migration started immediately after World War II, and there was a Windrush was the name of the boat that was carrying the migrants from the Caribbean to the UK for work, basically. So all these kind of things I sort of was part and parcel of in regards to my upbringing in the UK. My brothers and sisters, they came over one by one as my parents found it affordable to send for each child. And, that's how we were. And that's how the family sort of evolved within Britain itself. And I think I'm speaking for most Caribbean families, um, their journey has been a carbon copy of our journey.
So, how did you develop your songwriting skills?
Songwriting, it became organic and automatic, if you want for a better term. The earliest forms of songwriting, I would say, came in the form of poetry. When you're at school doing an English class and you're asked to write a poem about a particular thing, or write a poem about a poem that you've read, or any story that was you've been reading in a literature side of things, and someone asks you to imagine your spin and what you've read in poetry form. So I used to enjoy that quite a lot, sort of saying, rhyming words from the very beginning, not to mention the songs that were coming over from artists from Jamaica at the time that we used to listen to, you know, quite often, there's like with those Prince Buster, Derek Morgan, and all those kind of acts that was happening at the time. And there was also the British pop charts where there were songs just just really not from the radio stations or TV. You had Thank You Lucky Stars and Jukebox Jury. All these were like the national visual audio outlet for music. So there were a lot of acts at the time that we used to sit and watch. Dave Clark Five, Manfred Mann, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Herman and the Hermits, people like that. The list goes on.
And what exact year did Steel Pulse form?
The band formed in 1975. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary right now, but before the formation, so to speak, or the announcement, there's a Steel Pulse, and we obviously were learning our instruments, our craft. As some few months before that, we had a guitar player, Basil Gabinon, that was teaching myself, and then Ronald McQueen, the bass player, how to play, the guitar. It was a case of who was more inclined to play the music from a chord perspective or from the bass flat perspective. And I was fascinated in chords and what chords do and, lead guitar melodies. So I stuck with it.
And what was the first recording?
That's a very good question. I keep asking myself what was the very first recording. And when I really look back on it, the very first recording could have been a song that we did called Kabudu Mansata Obuku. And it's written based on the movie called Roots that was out at the time by Alex Haley. After watching that series, that set of episodes about the slave trade and stuff, we took it on ourselves to write a song based on the slave trade. So we had the bass player who wrote that song, Ronnie, and he just named, it's Kubudu Mansata Ubuku, were the names of three slaves taken from, Africa. I would say that would be the first recording, really, but that was done on a cassette, so to speak, and it was something that we recorded cassette and did an overdub kind of thing on the cassette, and it was very low budget and nothing official. Is what I'm saying. I'm sure the recording's out there somewhere, but it was nothing where it was, the creme de la creme when it comes to recording, if you see what I'm saying, as far as what one does in a studio, where you mix this and you mix that and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. But when it comes to the first official one, I would say it's after we won a reggae competition in the community, and the prize was a recording at one of the local prestigious recording studios within the community itself. So that would have been Handsworth Revolution. But it was Handsworth Revolution as a song in its earliest form, where with half the lyrics, not even half the lyrics were as you know it were in that particular song. Is what I'm saying. So that's another one that would be nice to get hold of. Everyone could find it. Yeah, but so that's where I look at it. I would say when it comes to first, hang on, let's have a go at recording something. Kibuda Mansata Ubuku, I would say comes at the top of the list. And Selvin, the keyboard player, was doing that song at the time. He was the one who actually was the lead vocalist on that song.
How did Steel Pulse get signed to Island?
We got signed to Ireland after doing tour with Burning Spear. Burning Spear was a three-piece band, and by the time they came to England, it was only one person, Winston Rodney himself, and he didn't come with the bands like as one would do it when they come from Jamaica. So Aswad was recently on Island Records, and they were no longer on the label, but they were on their way out from the label at the time, and they volunteered to be the artists that backed Burning Spear, where they actually were performing the instrumentation of Burning Spear live, which back in those days was more favorable when one is seen backing the a legendary reggae artist. And because in those days, reggae musicians were recognized in England when it came from England itself. So to be seen as a British reggae band backing a Jamaican artist was putting feathers in your cap and bringing you up the scale when it comes to recognition. And we took the opportunity to be the opening act for the act that was back in Burning Spear, which was Asla back in Burning Spear. And the record label Source on some of these dates that we did with Burning Spear when we were performing with him throughout Britain. And we're overwhelmed with our performance and the energy that we had and the visual aspects that we threw up as well, that they signed us at the very end of that year. So I'm saying, so we actually signed um, at the very end of 1977, going into 78. It didn't work for Aswad in the end because what they thought would have given them further recognition did the opposite when they decide to become a backing band for a major act. It was, worked against them in a sense. I don't know if Brinsley would admit that, but that's what happened at the time. You see what I'm saying? And it took them a while to get back to the groove and to the Aswad that people were accustomed to knowing. And eventually they sort of shook the backing band tag off them and became the Aswad as who we've known to grow and love. But that's what went down back then.
One song I was always fascinated with was Prediction. I love the complexity of the arrangements on that song and how it seems to like be going into one song into another, like three in one. What inspired that song in particular?
It was in a time where Steel Pulse was all about trying to develop a new idea when it came to lyric writing, when it came to even the execution of songs, and in the style of playing. If you notice, it was a flamenco guitar that introduced the whole song itself. So it was a case of us trying to come with something new, something that was completely different than what's normally recognized or sort of people would acknowledge reggae for. And it was just really us doing a lot of researches myself, in particularly when it comes to the history of ourselves, the race, and that's why and I sort of compared a lot of the heroes that we respected throughout history as part of the individuals that God connect them to characters in the Bible. So we sort of had Marcus, for example, that we see as someone who was pointing the way for someone who's going to be greater in the whole scheme of things, which is Haile Selassie, which John the Baptist did in regards to Jesus the Messiah. So that's why we sort of paired Marcus Garvey with John the Baptist, and we paired Haile Selassie with the tale of the Messiah all over again. And then you got Paul Bogle and William Gordon. You know, there were martyrs of freedom. If you read the Bible itself, again, there was lots of martyrs like Stephen that got stoned. Peter, one of them got hanged. And if you read the characters of the disciples that were in the Bible, I sort of compared them to people who were respected as activists and revolutionaries that had throughout history. So that's how we sort of come together with that song, comparing all the heroes that we've known to love throughout history to characters of the Bible.
Right. Now moving to the follow-up album, Tribute to the Martyrs. I'd love to know about the song Uncle George.
Yeah. Uncle George is. The term Uncle George came because after a while, I'm looking at the age group, and we're talking about George Jackson, who was a political figure, political activist um, in the 60s. And when I compare the time when he was born, which was in the 30s and so on, he was old enough to be an uncle for me, If you see what I'm saying, a relative, so to speak. Yeah, so George Jackson was a political figure that we started to follow in the local black newspapers that we had at the time, where he was known to have stolen $70 from a gas station in California. And that led to him being imprisoned. And before you know it, he's serving a life sentence on death row for the killing of some prison officer. And we sort of followed that case for several months, or got into years, if you see what I'm saying, because George, up until that time, was incarcerated for a good part of 10 years. Then his brother made an attempt to free him in Marin County in California. And during the attempted, um, what we want to call it, break-in into the courtroom, he kidnapped the judge and members of the jury, I believe, and had them all in a van with intentions to take them away and hold them ransom for freeing his brother. And the police, history has it, the police shot everybody to death anyway and held Angela Davis responsible for the gun that Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's younger brother, who was 16 years old at the time, had in his possession. And she became the most wanted woman in America for that. So George Jackson was about telling the story of what happened to George Jackson, if you see what I'm saying. And that's what the song's about. And what's even more interesting is that we had no idea that Bob Dylan wrote a similar song about the situation. Because up until that time, I didn't know Bob Dylan. Didn't know him from a can of paint, let alone his lyrics and his songs, if you see what I'm saying. Because, what Bob Dylan was singing about was far removed from our culture for us to recognize. And then he was an American again. To know that we're saying we were really, a lot of the songs that we're pulling for back then were all about the American experience. You see what I'm saying? So that made us another reason why we became apart from the other reggae musicians that were happening at that time. Because a lot of things we were echoing in our songs was really about the American experience. And no other reggae acts were doing that at the time, whether they came from England or from Jamaica. It was just us talking about what we, Ku Klux Klans and other American experience, if you see what I'm saying. And the list goes on in what we were sharing at our, anxiety and our disapproval, what was going on with us as black people across the planet. And we sort of linked ourselves with the American experience. That's what I'm saying. So a song like George Jackson was something that just came organically because of how we felt at the time, what we were experiencing in Britain. That's what I'm saying. The kind of racism we had in police. George was incarcerated. There's a lot of incarcerations of blacks happening in England at that time. And we just thought there was a strong connection. There was some kind of magnetism going on there. And we just sort of churned them out as we felt them. That's what I'm saying. But like I said, it was only many years after that we recognized that Bob Dylan was in the same, in the same atmosphere as far as the vibration. If you recognize, years later, I sort of covered that very song that Bob Dylan did of George Jackson. I mean, from Handsworth, from tribute to the martyrs, African Holocaust, we talked about at least 2 decades of music that went down. And that's when I discovered Bob Dylan and wrote a song based on the same incident. That's what I'm saying.
Now, how did Steel Pulse end up getting signed to Elektra?
When we got signed to Island, it was, how can I put it? It was like almost as if we fell into a bed of roses, one for a better phrase. Everything was like honky dory. It was like fame and fortune overnight. We couldn't believe it. It was happening so fast. The climate was right. There's a lot of tension between, the blacks born in Britain and the police, the government, when it came to unemployment, the curriculum in schools. There was a big problem. Is what I'm saying. And Steel Pulse happened to have echoed that energy and have reverberate throughout the Britain. And it was like, because we found out that all the communities across the nation was feeling exactly the same way. That's what I'm saying. And if you know, riots followed, just like we said it would when we said Handsworth Revolution. But the actual revolution started in Bristol as opposed to Handsworth. But the main thing is that there was a revolution going on with Britain where blacks were not satisfied with the conditions that were there and what they were subjected to. And then the tide started to change when the punk rock era died down and there was a revival of ska music going on. We had like the Specials, Bad Matters, um, Fun Boy 3, and there's another, so many of them, Selector. All these type of bands were just emerging, and they're all, playing this ska revival, which we thought at the time was music that was so dated. But we've been there, done that. Because if you know the history of reggae and Jamaican Caribbean music, ska was back in the 50s and 60s. And to know that we're here now in the 70s, going into the 80s, and having a muse that was back there about good 15, 20 years before, now becoming like the creme de la creme when it comes to the radio station's acceptance, we didn't know what to do. So we weren't fitting in, but we were touring Europe and we're hitting places like, France, Germany, and Holland, in particular in Belgium, those four main countries. I mean, there was Italy as well and Spain, but those are the four countries where the energy of roots reggae was really soaring and vibrant and out there making enough noise, if you saw what I'm saying. But back in Britain, it was a scary revival that was happening. So the record labels started to take a view of the music that we were producing and didn't recognize our efforts over time. Record sales started to go down, and I think by the time we got to the third album, although it was signed for three albums, the record labels sort of called it a day, and we were at rock bottom. You know, they confiscated equipment that they sort of had us have back in those days, and that's how we got off the label. Basically, by the end of 1980 we were rock bottom. There was no label, nothing. And we just took our chance to go to the United States. And we took our chance only to recognize that, we were hoodwinked into believing that nobody knew us in America. That's what the record label was telling us. As we were wasting our time because we made an attempt to go there previous year to open for the Police. It was a huge band in Britain. It was that. So that was going on back then. There was a lot of bands like the Police that were knocking around, that were playing reggae music, but just so happened to be fronting it because they were white people fronting the music. Now, is what I'm saying. So the Police became a success band, and rightly so because they were very good at acting their own rights anyway. You see what I'm saying? And we missed the opportunity to open for Sting and the Police in America at the time, and the opportunity came for us to come to the United States and perform in the latter part of 1980. We did that, and it was all everything just opened. The doors started opening up for us again, and by 81, after touring the United States for a good solid year, we recorded an album in Denmark, came back with it, and got signed to a record label. Within 6 months of that album being recorded, and there you go. It was the birth of us being associated with the Elektra Records with True Democracy album. So that's what happened.
Now, how did the song Lego Beast come about?
Lego Beast is a term. Let's see what a term is first of all. Lego Beast is what we call in Britain. Someone who's a Lego Beast is like, well, what the Londoners would say, a slapper, or a slapper, or a, it's another word for it, town bike, or a lady of easy virtue. So what I'm saying, or someone that, and so that's what we tend to call women that are sort of give their bodily parts up freely. So what I'm saying. Used to read the Bible a lot. more then than now, but the stories of the Bible stay with me. And there was a lot of reading when it came to the words of King Solomon. That's what I'm saying. And the story of Leggo Beast really based on an experience, but also something that King Solomon often did, sort of visualize certain things, just sitting, looking through a window and seeing how things were, if you see what I'm saying. So that's where the story came from. When I look back on it, on the old had a song that called Pimp's Paradise. And that could have been an influence as well. You see what I'm saying? She loves to party, have a good time. You see what I'm saying? That kind of thing. So with all that and the terminology from Lady Beast Virtue, Leg Beast, the Jamaican term. Um, I think that song came about with all these ingredients at my disposal. We had a particular band member who didn't like the song because it was almost as if he was slacking women down, but he wasn't. He was like see the situation and recognize it for what it is. So as a result, we sort of not bothered to practice that song when it came to performing it live. So we did a tour in '82 in St. Thomas, and we performed, and we were coming off stage, and the audience wouldn't let us come off stage. They said, "You're not going anywhere till you play Lego Beast." We didn't know the song because we actually recorded it in the studio and left it right there. You see what I'm saying? But they refused to let us come off stage until we performed the song. So we had to jam it out. So from there, we recognized that when it came to the Caribbean islands, being the Caribbean terminology, everybody in the Caribbean sort of cottoned on to that particular type of song.
And what's the story behind the song Your House?
Well, I didn't write that song. Let's get it straight. But the song, the percussion player also, he wrote that song. He's a prolific songwriter in his own rights. But he wrote that based on a breakup that was happening between him and his wife at the time, and he thought him writing something to I'd say win her back in a sense, because it was the case he didn't. It wasn't a marriage he wanted to walk away from. I think he wanted to keep it going, and I thought him writing that song meant it would have sort of solidified the situation far more than what it was becoming. Sort of I'm saying. So that's how that song came into play. But at the same time, it's a song that could be interpreted in so many different ways for whoever, for how they're feeling about the circumstance they so happen to be in. That's what I'm saying. Some people say literally living in a house. Some people are saying it's a figurative way of expressing yourself. And some people it's like for the sake of the melody. That's what I'm saying. So, that's what music does to you. It makes you pick the things that that means something to you. I know lots of people when it comes to Lego beads, they can say, I can identify with that. My woman cheated on me when I was gone, that kind of thing. So, that's what music does to you. You pick the ingredients to what satisfy you or what makes you feel more energized to move on when it comes to life.